Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is James Hollis. Jim is a Jungian psychoanalyst, author, and public speaker. After gaining a PhD from Drew University in Madison, New Jersey in 1967, he worked for 26 years as a lecturer in Humanities. In 1977, he retrained as a Jungian psychoanalyst at the Jung Institute in Zürich, Switzerland. For many years, he was executive director of the Jung Educational Center in Houston, Texas, and was executive director of the Jung Society of Washington until 2019. He still runs a private practice as a Jungian psychoanalyst in Washington, D.C., and is the author of 16 books. One of his books, Under Saturn's Shadow, focuses on the psychology of men, which is what we talk about today. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with James Hollis. Jim, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Privileged to be with you, James.
So we're going to be talking today about the psychology of men, and I had an experience of resistance around this topic that I think would be a good place to start, because I've been a fan of your work in this topic for several years, and it's taken me a while to get around to inviting you onto the podcast, even though I've known all along I've wanted to do it. And in your work, you talk about when you wrote your book on the topic, Under Saturn's Shadow, back in the 90s, you also had a kind of experience of resistance, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I did. I was asked to speak on this subject back in Philadelphia in the early 90s, and uncharacteristically, I postponed. And I had to ask myself the question therapists at times have to ask themselves as well. What would you say to someone else who came to you with this problem? And I would say, well, that's called resistance, And resistance is in direct proportion to the encounter with some sort of fear. That was revealing to me, because then I thought to myself, so what are you afraid of? And then it was like a voice inside said, but these are secrets. This is a secret. Don't talk about it. I thought, my goodness, where did that come from? That was an old voice inside of me. And so I had to ask myself, what are these secrets? And then they started bubbling up. And then I realized it was my duty to start sharing those secrets. And I was amazed at my own internal resistance, because I think I was conditioned like other boys and other men to keep that stuff within. And so the risk was to share those secrets. But what I found in having done so is men literally around the world have written to say, I always thought there was something wrong with me, that I had these concerns or these apprehensions. And now what I'm learning from you is, we all have them, and that's what increases our sense of isolation that is so harsh on the men's souls, essentially.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it feels like it's, you write about this as well, it feels like it's kind of policed through a psychology of shame and anxiety. It's very kind of isolating. That's kind of the core of it. And so reading your work, it really, it does have a certain thrilling quality of like encountering these secrets that we carry, and that we, as you say yourself, that are kind of secrets to ourselves often. But then when I read your work, I kind of recognize things, and it feels very positive to kind of. It feels like in some way the burden's being dropped. The cat's out of the bag. You don't have to. It doesn't have to be this thing that you carry.
That's correct. Sure. And the first secret was the most obvious, is that men have been as much governed by role expectations and definitions and constrictions as women have. Women have been courageously over the last century challenging those definitions and breaking out of them to great effect, I think. Men are just still tumbling to the fact that so much of our lives have been governed by these expectations that we grow up with.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's a great context to put this conversation in, I think, because we're very much skipping ahead over the history of kind of male domination and obviously all the harm that has been done to women. I'm at least taking that for granted, the audience, that we're skipping over that, and we're focusing on that actually there is this extra interesting piece that it's not that men are prancing around having a lovely time with all their power. They're also governed and conditioned and kept from knowing themselves and being full people, right, through these systems that they're forced to kind of take part in.
Yes, and on a few occasions I've been asked by women to talk about those strange creatures called men. And by the way, no men's group has ever asked me to talk about how would I better understand a woman, which is interesting, you see. They're more willing to listen to us and open up to considerations than we are in return, I suspect. But what I've said to women is imagine three things. First of all, that The close friends that you have, those persons with whom you discuss your marriage, your children, your fears, your body, the real important issues in your life, those friends are gone forever. You can never speak of those things. Secondly, imagine that the link between you and your guiding source, call it your instinct, call it your intuition, whatever you call it, that's severed. And thirdly, imagine that from here on out, your worth as a human being is largely defined by meeting abstract standards of productivity out there in a competitive world, standards that are set by total strangers. Now, if you could imagine those three things, you would have some insight into the conditioning of men. And women have been appalled by that because they all say, oh, that would be so horrible. That would be so lonely. And I said, indeed it is. Indeed it is. And most men are so conditioned, they haven't even thought about those conditions, but they're there.
Right. Yeah, it's very insidious, the conditioning. You really can go a long time without noticing it. For myself, I thought I'd got off relatively scot-free. I didn't identify as kind of macho, and I didn't think I had the kind of, toxic masculine traits. It took me a very long time to see that what I valued, valuing things like stoicism to the point where you're putting yourself through things and it's leaking out in other ways in kind of, unhealthy behavior and stuff like that. That's all part of the same picture, right?
You're absolutely right. Whenever something is repressed in a person, it doesn't go away. It's what Freud called the return of the repressed. And you're right to use the metaphor, it leaks out. Leaks out in our behaviors, in our dreams, or our unconscious mechanisms that govern our lives. And so men wind up in aggressive postures or self-medicating or walking around with depressions that are undiagnosed. All of these things are in a certain way that leakage you referenced of the fact that they're living a kind of self-imposed as well, self-estrangement and a suppression of their emotional truth.
Right. It might be worth giving a kind of overview of Jungian psychology, because that's the context, I guess, in which we're discussing these ideas. And in particular, the title of the book, Under Saturn's Shadow, I found the concept of the shadow, which I tend to think of, correct me if this is an inappropriate use of it, but I think of it as a kind of the part of the unconscious that is the stuff that we don't want to face, that we're kind of turning away from. I find that to be an incredibly useful concept. So perhaps we could just say a bit about the kind of Jungian picture in which we're talking about here.
Sure. Well, basically, Jung's concept of the shadow is that it's all of those aspects of our own personality or of our organizations that if we bring them into consciousness, we find they're troubling, maybe contradictory to our values and intentions, and in general, undermining the kind of life we want to live. Or on some occasions, they represent challenges to us that are too intimidating. For example, Jung essentially concluded, and I would also agree, that our biggest shadow is, as he said, we all walk in shoes too small for us, psychologically speaking. We live timorous, self-protected lives. And there are good reasons for that, because we all start off as tiny, dependent, and vulnerable children. So we have to learn defenses of one kind or another. And so we get identified with those defenses. And the more we do, the summons to live our journey as best we can do that becomes impossibly intimidating and often leads us to a kind of safe, cautious, and sort of conditioned and protective life. But generally speaking, the shadow represents all the elements of myself or my groups and associations, because universities, churches, governments, all institutions, no matter how noble their intent, have a dark side to them if we examine it very carefully.
Right. Yeah, that almost makes me think of a lot of the way we deal with issues in society, putting people in prison, things like that. It seems to be almost like a societal version of the shadow where, instead of a therapeutic model, say, of rehabilitation, we kind of want to not think about certain aspects and not look at the causes, right? I think that's really interesting. And so also with the Jungian picture, I mean, we're talking here about gender, and I feel like he was writing a time where gender binaries were very strong, and he seemed to be very ahead of his time in seeing every human as a complex kind of multifaceted synthesis, right? And so you have this idea of the animus and the anima. Is that right? Different
That's correct.
inside everyone.
Yeah, literally a century ago, he was saying, whatever our outer gender identification, there's an intrapsychic element that in some way embodies the contrary energies. Today, we might criticize those concepts even now as being a little gender bound as he described them, but after all, it was a century ago. And it was very revolutionary to think that inside of each woman was some sort of, quote, masculine energy that was either repressed or was oppressive in her life or seeking, to express itself. And for men, that inner life that was often seen contrary to his ego identity is sort of his feminine soul. Anima is Latin for soul, after all. And where do men connect with their soul? Well, that's a good question. You have to ask each man singularly and say, what does that mean to you? For example, in therapy, if on several occasions with men, no matter what their background in terms of religion and so forth, I've asked the question, do you think you have a soul, however you understand that word? And if so, what is it asking of you? And interestingly enough, to this point, no man has ever said, no, I don't have a soul, or that concept makes no sense to me, because we understand it's a metaphor for something very deep within that represents our truth or our core. And we're not always in a friendly relationship with that, but we know in some way what it might be asking of us.
Right. And so if you take a man who resists integrating the feminine aspects of themselves, and again, you pointed to this, and we should reiterate, you're good in your work at saying things like so-called feminine, right? Which I think signals to the fact that often these things are kind of circular. We enforce a certain patriarchal standard on men, and we come to call that masculine. There's no kind of essentialism here, but we'll sometimes use these words, in a way that people colloquially do. But so a man who's suppressing aspects of themselves that are kind of that we might call feminine, is that something that could then be the basis for kind of misogyny or homophobia and these projecting onto other people these issues?
Of course. One of the secrets that I identified was that the feminine energy was much larger and more important in men's lives than they ever could acknowledge. And because it was, in fact, so powerful, that's one reason they spend so much time, anesthetizing it or projecting it onto others. You see it particularly among adolescent youth who are the least secure in their own sense of emergent masculine identity. And so the homophobia among them is enormous. And any sign of a weakness, so-called weakness in a boy, or any sign of extra sensitivity is often immediately identified, attacked, and shamed. I think all of us as men early on in our development experience shame when we reveal ourselves emotionally to other boys. And so we learn, you just don't go there. And we become our own gatekeepers, if you will.
Right. Yeah, I was having a conversation with a man recently who happens to be gay, and he said something that really, I thought was very deep, that when he was wrestling with the idea of being in the closet, he realized that the closet wasn't for him. It was kind of the people who were kind of policing, sexuality, which I thought was very profound. That it's created by the people who have anxieties around their own identity, and I thought it was really moving because it conjures up the image of someone just choosing to have nothing to do with it and just choosing to be empowered and free. I thought it was very beautiful. So yeah, I think I feel like people struggling with their own shadows is the basis for a huge amount of discord in our society.
That's true. I have a colleague in San Francisco who said once, it usually takes a man a year in therapy before he's at the place a woman can usually begin her first session. And that's about talking about what's really happening inside. Now, if that's true, and maybe it's an exaggeration, but it's an appropriate metaphor. If that's true, that's a portrait of self-estrangement. That's a portrait of being cut off from one's inner vitalizing energies. Because one of the questions I ask men is, when do you think you started shutting down emotionally? And at first, they can't answer the question, but the more they reflect on it, the anecdotes start rising to the surface. And oh yes, back in the third grade or something like that, I remember this happened, or this happened on the playground. And they carry those stories, often times of shaming, times of failure, times of ridicule and isolation, and they carry it within. And from that point on, it's like, that's the last place I'm going to go. That's the place in me I will not allow you to see, you see.
Right. I heard in a lecture you gave a story you said of someone who was very successful, and they were asked to kind of come back and give a talk at their school, and they couldn't believe that they were actually wanted because of the bullying they'd experienced, right?
That's right. This particular gentleman had actually been a college president, and he was invited to actually speak to his alumni group. It was at Yale University. And he said, I couldn't imagine anybody would want to have me talk to them, because he remembered this particular, what he called the red surrender, where he was beaten up by this kid in a very public way with red hair, and dirt was heaped into his face, and all the other boys stood around and laughed at him. And that sort of became one of his central stories. And so no matter what his adult accomplishments, that story was the core story, so to speak. And that's why more of men's behavior arises out of a sense of shame or failure or inadequacy, because if the message is conveyed to you that life is a zero-sum game, there are winners and losers all the time, and don't be a loser, then your sense of self is up for grabs every day in some different arena. And it leads to horrible competitiveness, which ultimately is destructive. We see nations in conflict because of the complexes of some of their leaders. Women historically are, of course, capable of the same kind of competitiveness, but in most cases, they learned early, we're far better off in working this out, finding some sort of cooperation whereby we achieve our mutual goals. And everybody's better off for that. But for men, it's like somebody has to stand at the top of the hill. And if it's not you, it's going to be the other guy.
Right. And it seems that, the conditioning that happens, it's almost like a virus, it seems, where, as you say, if someone has felt shamed, they feel insecure about their identity. And so they go on to try and shame someone else to kind of mask their own fear, right? If they feel stronger than someone else, then people aren't going to see their weakness. And you write about people or men often being kind of strangers to themselves, which I think is a concept that's worth stopping on, because it can seem kind of odd, like how could I possibly be a stranger to myself? But it seems to me the idea of I think Jung wrote about like integration, right? The idea of being an integrated whole. And it seems to me when you don't know yourself, you're kind of fractured, I guess. There are parts of yourself that other parts don't know. That's right.
They are operating autonomously. They'll show up in unconscious behaviors or projections onto other people or in people's dreams, you see. Again, that which is repressed doesn't go away. It always goes somewhere. It can actually go into the body and become a somatic disorder as well. So to give a quick example, men seldom weep in therapy, but it's been my experience through the years, 90% of the time when tears suddenly come, he is as surprised as anybody by those tears. Like, oh, I didn't know that was there, in effect. And then usually he's apologized, as if there's something to apologize for. Like, oh, I'm sorry about that. In other words, I felt a real emotion. I apologize for that. I mean, think about that. That's the way it is. And interestingly enough, the 90% of the time, when the tears have come, it's when they start talking about their father. It wasn't their lost child. It wasn't their divorce. It was when they started talking about their father. And one of the terrible secrets of men's lives is this enormous hunger for the connection to the nurturant and mentoring father, which is so missing in our time. Because we have to remember the conversation we're having today was not available to my father, to your grandfather. And they were tremendously governed by role expectations. And what you don't do is challenge them, because that immediately puts you outside the pale. So we have information now, and more importantly, permission to address some of these issues that our fathers never had. And they were by and large lost souls, really lost souls.
Right. I think the point you made of apologizing for having visible emotions in crying seems a really important one, because it seems to me that a very common dynamic amongst men is a fear that they are not perhaps going to receive support and care, or not deserving of support and care. And so if they take up any space emotionally, if they cry, we all instinctively know if someone's crying, you should probably comfort them. But I almost detect in a lot of men an anxiety that if they cry, it's followed immediately by a panic of, what if I'm not going to get nurturing? What if I'm not going to get support? Which could arise from parental dynamics, as you're kind of suggesting, or kind of the culture suggesting that men just don't do that. Men don't get that support and that nurturing. And I see this playing out a lot. Do you think that's that kind of that insecurity of perhaps not having received care is a component in this?
It certainly is. I think it's more that the expression of emotion of that nature makes you so vulnerable that you're at the mercy of the situation. Even if it's in the presence of a therapist who is ostensibly in partnership with you for your well-being, you see, that even in that moment, what it constellates is the old analog. Oh, I just opened the doors to my inner fortress, and now people can see me as I am. And that's why, as I mentioned, that university president, when invited to speak at another setting, felt so completely unworthy, because his core story was of childhood shaming, not of all of his record of accomplishments. Because in each man, there is a lake of tears and a mountain of anger. And the anger comes from suffering this continuing suppression of his identity, of his potential wholeness, by the circumstances in which he finds himself. This is one reason men are, 10 times more violent than women, or more likely to kill themselves, more prone to drugs and alcohol, to anesthetize that inner split, and so forth. So, put that together and you realize men are a pretty endangered species, because they are adrift. They've had their hands on the tools, the instruments of destruction, and have, unfortunately, as you pointed out, used them, and are by and large strangers to themselves. And what is it that is the enemy? The enemy is always within. The enemy is fear. The enemy is our lethargy, our desire to be taken care of, our desire to, sleep the sleep of childhood, and so forth. And yet, if you don't have a living relationship to your own psyche, how are you ever going to experience any kind of healing? That's the real question for men. Usually when men come into therapy, it's because there's a problem with the marriage, there's a problem with the career, or maybe there's an intractable depression, or there's an addiction issue, or something like that. Even in therapy, and by the way, the word therapy comes from the Greek verb that means to listen or attend to. Psyche is soul, so it means listening or attending to your soul. They always want to talk about the problem out there, rather than really let's look within and see what's happening within me.
Right. And when it comes to how, I guess, adult men come to have these issues, it really seems like most cultures in the past perhaps had traditions and kind of traditions that people had to kind of pass through, rites of passage that would allow people to mature psychologically. And it feels like we live in a time where we don't have that. And so you're permitted to get to kind of grow into adulthood and take on positions of responsibility when you are psychologically, you're in kind of arrested development as a boy, basically, who still hasn't resolved certain issues.
That's absolutely true. And this is particularly unique to our time and cultures, because the rites of passage in the past arose out of our ancestors' perception that one does have to overthrow that lethargic power inside of each youth and adolescent. I want to be taken care of. I don't want to go out and deal with the rigors of the world. And so they evolved these rites that were remarkably similar throughout the cultures of the ancient world, and knowing that they didn't come from somebody handing out, leaflets that would tell people how to do this. Intuitively, our ancestors around the world discerned what sorts of things they needed to address. First of all is the departure from the hearth. I'm using the hearth now as the whole parental world that will presumably protect and take care of and nurture the child. But we can't stay there, because if we do, the tribe has no adults on the frontier. So their departure was usually sometimes violent. You never get an engraved invitation. You were taken away. Secondly, a ceremony of death, which itself is frightening, often by figures who were wearing masks and paints and so forth, because they represented the gods or, some form of tutelary spirits, not your uncles from down the road. It's these are the transcendent figures, spiritual figures, essentially. And the death was the death of the naivete and unconsciousness of the child, and then typically teaching. And there are three areas of teaching: the tribal stories of origin, who we are as a tribe, where we fit into the big scheme of things, what life is about, whither do we go at the end of this journey, etc. What do the gods want from us? Secondly, the polity of that tribe, the rights, duties, privileges, expectations, and what it means to be a man in that culture. And then thirdly, specific teachings, including agriculture, warfare, whatever the form may be. And then fourthly, it was the ordeal, whereby they would have to go and maybe live by themselves for a certain length of time in the jungle or on the tundra or in the prairie or wherever, wherein they would learn to cope with their fears and also to find resilience within. And then finally, to return to the tribe as a changed person, coming back as another adult on the scene. And these rites were sometimes extended over many months, depending on, again, the particular civilization, realizing that this was not something that happened just overnight. Today, what we have, and I have several clients who have adolescent sons and or postgraduate sons living at home, watching video games, pornography, doing pot every day, and not wanting to go out and deal with the world as it is. And these driving their parents crazy, but they somehow assume that their lifestyle, these are mostly middle and upper middle class kids, they assume that their lifestyle is somehow just something they're entitled to, rather than the fact somebody had to work, somebody had to earn, someone had to sweat to get that for them. But we say to a kid, go to college, go to university, go get a job, whatever, get some computer skills, and that's what we do. And so what we have are uninitiated males running around in big bodies, often big roles, and making big decisions. And psychologically, not yet, as you pointed out, adults,
right?
Which is not healthy for the culture.
And in one of your lectures, you made this kind of this statement about the world that I thought was great. There was that we're very easily overwhelmed by this vast world that we face, but we're summoned to engage with it, kind of take it on, and that's really our circumstance, which I thought was great, because it's common, some people who have been overwhelmed by the world will just, declare that the universe is hostile and it's suffering and bad. Mm-hmm. And on the other extreme, you might have people who say, no, we can easily dominate nature. One day we'll eradicate death, and, technology will save us. And that just seemed to be a very nice statement of our genuine circumstance. There's a challenge here. It's not easy, but we're summoned to to take it on. And in these rituals, it seems that it seems an antidote to kind of egoism, like you're getting outside of yourself and seeing that you're part of something bigger, right? Including the worldview of the culture and these other aspects. And so without that, do you think, it seems to me that the kinds of, boys running around in adult bodies that we see have issues of kind of egoism, narcissism, these issues that are kind of at the other end of a worldview where you see you're part of something bigger. That's
right. Rather than a kind of tribal vision that animates one's life and gives one a sense of connection and purpose, what we offer today in popular culture in the West, at least in many parts of the East, are materialism, possess, you fill the emptiness within by buying something new and shiny. Hedonism, it's all about having a good time. And thirdly, narcissism. It's all about you. It's all about you. It's not about your connections with people or with human beings or causes or whatever. I'll give you a quick example here. My father was pulled out of 8th grade when the Great Depression came. This for child labor laws. Sent to work. Really, he was 13. He sent to work the rest of his life. My mother had been an orphan because her Swedish father had come to America to be a coal miner, and he was killed in a cave-in. So she grew up in poverty. So both of them grew up in poverty, and both of them worked every day, dawn to dusk. And that's what I grew up with. So I knew as a child, anything that was on the table or the roof above our head, somebody had worked for, and somebody had really, suffered for. And I never took that for granted. The difference is I was, thanks to a modern civilization, living in a time not like Jude the Obscure, for example, Hardy's last novel. I was allowed to get an education, and that led me to be able to choose my work rather than just take the job that life brought me. And I've been fortunate that I've been able to enjoy the world that I live in through teaching and therapy and so forth. But to this day, I always think about the concept of productivity. I don't see it as a kind of oppression. It's the difference is I'm privileged to be able to do something that is meaningful to me. That's why we're communicating today. I'm 81 years old. I've just been through 2 major bouts with cancer, and I'm doing well. But my daily motto is shut up, suit up, show up. And I say it to myself every day, here, not necessarily aloud, right? Shut up means, you are privileged. There are people whose children are being killed. There are people who don't have a roof over their head. There are people who don't have food tonight. You have things. You're privileged, so shut up. Secondly, suit up means prepare, work hard, do what you have to do. Discipline yourself in areas that matter to you. And thirdly, show up. Just do the best you can, not show off. Do the best you can. That's what life asks of you, you see. So I think, again, how privileged one is to have had adversity to deal with. We all have to have our shipwrecks, because it's only after that you begin to realize, I can float to the surface again. I have a resilience within me. That's one of the things that the young people had to learn in their times of ordeal, an internal resilience, that nature has equipped you with resources, and you need to know about them. You need to draw upon them. Most important of which was courage and not quitting, persistence, and continuing to throw yourself at the problem until the problem began to bend. And you take all that away, and you have, as you said, guys in big bodies and big roles out there, but adolescent psychology. And that's not a very healthy combination. It's not good for our society, and it certainly undermines the quality of relationships too.
Right. I think on the issue of shutting up, I think there's an interesting, thing to be differentiated between entitled, self-indulgent kind of complaining versus communicating one's feelings, right? Because it's worth clarifying that I'm sure you're not suggesting to men that they shouldn't communicate more about their feelings.
No. And thanks for making that clarification. No, certainly that. By shut up, I mean, I don't want to be taking things for granted. Right. I want every day to feel productive in some way that makes sense to my own soul. It's not so much about making money or something like that. I'm not trying to advance my career, but I want to feel productive every day, that I'm somehow bringing something into this world and responding to it in a creative way. But we're not entitled to anything other than a right and a responsibility for being, in the struggle for life itself. Now, again, the biggest enemy always is self-estrangement. I mean, those youth who are cruising along without a sense of purpose and so forth are really at some level miserable too. That's the other side of it. They might be trying to have a good time, but underneath that is, I think, the specter of emptiness. And they all know it. And of course, that's why they have to be so busy being non-busy, as it were.
Right. And I know you've written recently a lot about kind of how meaning is the point of life rather than just seeking happiness, right? You're not just seeking to kind of reach some elevated state all the time. And it seems to me that finding purpose and meaningful work is, or even, beyond work, the kind of meaning you would get from, as you say, belonging to a tribe with a worldview that you feel connected to. When we don't have that, it's replaced by, I've also heard you say that the kind of the god of our culture is the economy rather than actually having kind of mythologies. And it does seem that most of us are born into situations of kind of coercion where you're forced to go down a coal mine or, do other things that you didn't choose. It's not what you would be spending your time doing if you could have the authentic expression of your soul, right?
That's right. That's right. No, and underneath all of that, you touched on something very important. The traditional cultures, and I don't want to romanticize life that was poor, nasty, brutish, and short, as John Locke said. But if you have stories that link you to the mysteries, why are we here? That's our relationship to the cosmos as a mystery. That link us to nature, where we realize we are part of a living fabric with nature. And that's one we've gotten terribly wrong, as we all know, which is why nature's biting us back. Stories that link us to our people. Who is my tribe today? To whom do I belong? Am I just rootless or do I belong somewhere? And fourthly, the mystery of individual journey. What is my journey about? And how does it differ from yours, you see? Those are all in some way sacred links. And when they're severed or eroded, then the person's adrift, psychologically adrift. And therefore, he or she is left in our contemporary culture, again, responding to the loudest voice, to some, pseudo cause, or to, again, some shiny new object that's going to attract him for a very short time, and that its worth just sort of diminishes.
Right. And so earlier you mentioned that a lot of the issues we're talking here get kind of passed down almost father to son, like the desire for a kind of healthy connection between father and son is something that's often frustrated and can lead to these issues. I think in some of your work, you quoted a figure of saying in a survey, it was something like 13 or 17% of people said they had a positive relationship with their father, perhaps of men. Do you think that having these kind of, I guess, psychologically stunted fathers is a major route of transmission of these issues?
Well, I think so, certainly, because again, I say this with deep sympathy for our fathers. Most of them were lost sons because it's been over a century now when men moved off the cultivation of the land or moved out of individual crafts or were teaching something very tangible to their sons. Or if you weren't following your father's footsteps, at least you had some kind of connection to the masculine world, whatever that meant. And you take that away. I mean, when men moved to the factories and came home essentially broken in spirit, or moved to offices which were spiritless in their own way too, something terrible happened to the soul of men. And it happened, late 19th, early 20th century, and I think is progressed. And so when you ask today, what produces that stirring of the soul for a man? What produces the inner fire that gives him a sense of direction and purpose? Well, it almost doesn't exist for most men, unfortunately. In other words, what is so important that you're willing to live for it? Now, it's certainly true that people will grow up with some kind of abstract notion of being rich or powerful or living a certain kind of lifestyle, and that will carry them for a while. But it ultimately ends in a sense of stoicism. Joseph Campbell put it once: you spend your life climbing the ladder only to realize it's been placed against the wrong wall. There's no there at the top of the heap, you see. I mean, that's the terrible secret of the corporate struggle or building one's resume. You get there and there's no there. And that's a grand betrayal at some level.
Right. I think that's a great point about these kinds of wounded fathers being kind of lost sons, and that there's a kind of a constant kind of recursive cycle where if you are someone who, if you're a baby who didn't have a healthy relationship with kind of your caregivers, and then you get developmentally stunted at that point, and now you're an adult and you have no models of how to do this, you have no models of how to be a kind of a healthy parent, and now there's this young person looking to you for that. It's kind of, when you get inside the mindset of something like that, it's kind of understandable why you have kind of absent fathers, people running away from a sense of being overwhelmed and just being triggered by this responsibility they have no idea how to take on.
That's right. Of course, who makes baby is young people. And, that's the nature of nature. And they're often struggling just to escape from their own family of origin or whatever the circumstances are, are psychologically immature, and they have babies. And if I were ever appointed emperor of the universe, I wouldn't allow people to date until they were 50. You can't get married till you're 75, and you can't think of having children till you're 100 years old, because it's a very complicated business. And people have no idea the influence they have upon a child's psyche.
Right. I mean, the sentiment that it takes a village to raise a child has always resonated with me. I was always kind of very close to my grandmother, and I felt having someone, those extra generations who are more experienced, is a really healthy thing in child raising.
That's right. Yes. Yes. The same was with my grandmother too. And she was a person full of stories of history. And I had a long and very deep interest in history. And that's one of the things I most learned from her. A kind of funny story. Once, I think I was about 6 or 7. I was just learning to read. And she said, "What are you interested in?" And I said, "Oh, I think history." And she said, "Well, modern or ancient history?" And I thought, "Oh, history is ancient." So I said ancient, right? And so the next thing I knew, for a holiday or birthday or something, she'd gotten me a book of some classical history book. And I remember seeing a lithograph in there of these big Roman matrions sending their sons off to war. And the young boys are marching off like this, and underneath they're saying to their sons, "Come back victorious, or come back on your shield." I thought, boy, those mothers were tough. They were saying to their boys, win or die, and I really internalized that. And I thought, well, that's what life is about. I mean, that and many other messages, of course. But underneath all of that, certainly that was a connection with a transpersonal wisdom, I think, that I experienced through my grandmother, certainly.
Right. And on the topic of mothers, you also read about, I think, what you call the mother complex and how that relates to these issues.
Sure. Well, normally speaking, our mother is the most important human being we've ever met, because we come from her body. She is typically present the most, not in every case, but in most cases, throughout our formative stage, through our first years, where we have an emergent sense of self and other and what that traffic's about. And then we go off to school, and typically our early school teachers are women as well. So boys grow up mostly with women these days. And it doesn't mean father is not important. It's just father is not present as much physically and often psychologically. And that's one reason why the fathers, that is, say, the tribal fathers, played such a role in the mentoring of youth. And by and large, the mentors are missing today. It's one of the biggest lacks of our culture, is where do you turn to for the men who can teach you about life? Not only the skills you need, that's useful, but what it means to be a man, or what's important in life and what's not important, and how do you tell the difference? And what do you do when you come up against the wall and you don't know how to get around it? I mean, those sorts of things are roiling inside of every young person, boy or girl. And if there's no one there to help mentor, because my other role in life has been as a teacher. I taught in colleges for many years, and I continue to teach on Zoom and so forth in classes. So I've always felt teaching was something I treasured. I think my teachers were the ones who helped me get some vision of a larger world out there, which is very essential. And certainly, obviously, as a therapist, I often play a mentoring role, as you can imagine. So this is something that's very much missing in the lives of boys. And there are male secrets, so to speak. Well, who passes on the secrets, and who teaches, and where is the place for male love, for example? Because it's love that heals. Even a dour personality like Freud, towards the end of his career, said once, "It's love that heals." It's not technique; it's love that heals. By love, we mean the capacity to care about and to affirm something. And, to care about the boy's soul and to care about his or her fears and to care about helping him see how you get across this abyss into adulthood. That's something that's pretty much missing in our time and place, as we've said.
Right. Yeah, it seems to me that to bring it back to the issue we spoke about early on of how these things get perpetuated, you're mentioning kind of vulnerability there, and for me, I feel like being emotionally vulnerable is the thing that I've done that's required the most strength in my life, I would say. And yet, because it's so it requires such courage, many men are not willing to do it, and so we get these kind of this propaganda of what real strength is emotional avoidance. What real strength is not talking about your emotions, which if you look at it on paper, it makes no sense. But we from a young age, before you can rationally figure out these things, you're I guess coerced into to playing this game, right, where you don't talk about your emotions.
That's right. Well, and the model that I grew up with was really the Marlboro Man or a John Wayne kind of figure, whose best friend was his horse and his guitar, and that was it. And, on the other hand, if men don't have a relationship to their own soul, guess what? They often will try to process that through women, you see. And they'll expect women to carry that nurturant dimension, which they're unable to give to themselves or share with each other. And that burdens the woman in some way. She may or may not be able or willing to play that role, but it also is a deferral of accountability. In a book on relationship called The Eden Project, I said there's an heroic question that every one of us in any relationship has to ask. And that is, what am I asking of that other that I need to address myself? Now, I say it's heroic because it takes an enormous courage, as you've suggested, to face that within myself, to say it's not wrong to feel dependent, but it's wrong to give into dependency, you see. It's not wrong to want to carry something emotional in my life, but I'm the one responsible for that. It's not my partner who has to carry that. And as we well know, too often men play out their emotional life through their women in their lives. I had a client once, a woman who said, "I am my husband's emotional dialysis machine." I never forgot that image. That she said he can't express anger, so he'll provoke it in me, and then he'll say, "You're angry." Or he wouldn't express sadness, and then he'd try to promote that in her, and then she'd express it. And it was almost like, if I can see it outside of me, then in some way I know what I'm dealing with. You see, well, that's a huge measure of internal estrangement for that to be the case.
Right, and I assume that was entirely unconscious, right?
Absolutely unconscious, of course.
Right, and I think a space where these issues play out and potentially a big space for healing is intimacy and friendships between men as well. Right. I mean, for myself personally, my whole life, again, this is an area where I thought I didn't have issues because I gravitated to similar people who are interested in talking about these kinds of things, where there's very open and getting to the root of it. But then I noticed a kind of female friends typically have this kind of constant touching base, which me and my male friends, we almost prided ourselves that we could go a year without speaking and immediately get down to business and putting the world to rights with these kinds of matters. And it took me a long time to realize that there's a very common, I think goes back to me, the thing I mentioned before of a fear of taking up space, a fear of requiring energy from other people. So there's almost a kind of day to day, I'm not addressing my needs, I'm living my life, I'm doing the productive thing. When I'm, in the pub with the friend, then we can really, fool ourselves into saying that we don't have any issues because we're very open about these kinds of matters. So it's interesting the way that I think these things can play out. And it definitely feels to me, when you're addressing these things in friendship, you're trying to make a kind of stepwise progression where I think you can trigger each other's anxieties or issues.
Right.
And you need, that's a difficult thing, right? To try and move together in that.
Well, you said a very revelatory thing there. You said, well, we can see each other every year and immediately get down to business, because that would be male conversation. What's the business that brings us together? In other words, and there have been studies in the difference between male and female communication. So I, as a male, always thought it peculiar with women. They'd spend time complimenting each other. I always thought that was somewhat hypocritical and so forth. But I came to realize through the work of Deborah Tannen and others that what that was about was creating a common area of conversation. So that would lead to other areas of communication. And for men, the common areas have typically been sports and politics and business, because they're in a sense safe topics. You can talk about them without talking about anything inside of you, because it's out there in some way. And again, that's part of it. For men, communication was always about problem solving rather than relating. There's a big difference there. And one could say those two elements of problem solving is important, but so is relating. And so when you create a relationship in which problem solving or addressing the needs at hand and relating in a good way to each other, then you have a much richer relationship. And in that area, women, I think, are pretty far ahead of men.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great differentiation, the idea of relating, because the in the example I was giving of myself, it's not that, we would be talking about these kinds of matters. So it felt like there wasn't an issue because we're willing to talk about, the stuff that's supposed to be off limits. But actually what wasn't there was the relating, was the continual kind of day-to-day touching base, which can stir those kinds of interpersonal anxieties that many of us carry. And so I think that's a really interesting differentiation to make. And I'm very interested in, I guess, this may be too, we've covered a lot of ground here, but do you have any advice for young men as to how they can navigate this kind of problematic landscape that they're moving through?
Well, I would hope they would just get conscious, first of all, that these issues even occur. I was on a podcast, interestingly enough, in the UK about 2 months ago, and I was asked the question as we were ending, what person in history would you most want to talk to if you could have a conversation? And my first thought was Lincoln, because I grew up in the same town that Lincoln lived in, and he was always a hero of mine as a boy. But as I thought about it, I said, I'd like to go back and talk to myself as a 10-year-old. And what I would tell that 10-year-old is, you're going to be okay. As a 10-year-old, I'd already learned to be buttoned up. I'd already learned to realize you don't talk about these things because the other guys are going to make it more difficult for you. I would say to him, your life is going to be interesting, challenging, painful at times, but it's going to be very rich, more than you can imagine. And, it's okay to be afraid. It's okay to have anxiety. These are normal and natural. I thought if I had those emotions, there was something wrong with me, because no one else would ever admit to them, you see. So I would have just tried to normalize his emotional life, tell him in time that would turn out to be a better guide for him than many of the parameters in the outer world, and that most of all, in time, to trust his own instincts, that's what would lead him through. Now, I didn't know that at 10, of course, and it took me many years to find these things out. And those are years, I think, that were of often a lot of wandering and a lot of self-estrangement, and the years of perhaps false choices. So I would have wanted to offer him a sense of trusting his inner life and his inner world. So I don't care at what age you talk to a person, that's the message that I still try to work with as a therapist. To say, look, there's something in you that knows what's right for you. And your key is to try to sort through all the traffic that you have, traffic from the outer world, but traffic from the inner world as well, that keeps you from hearing that voice. And in the end, if you can hear the voice of your own soul and try to live it as best you can in the reality conditions that the world has for us, your journey is going to be interesting. And it's not about being happy, as you mentioned. There's nothing wrong with happiness, but it's not a steady state. It's contextual. Happiness is a byproduct of being in right relationship to your own soul. And when you are, that will make you happy. Now, as a child, I would have imagined my best life was as a major sports figure, as a lot of children do. Well, I didn't get the body for that. And I could have never have imagined that I would spend my adult life talking to people hour after hour about their problems. I couldn't imagine that would be interesting or exciting, right? And yet, I can't imagine a more interesting thing, a more humbling thing than to be invited into a conversation with people around the meaning of their own journey. And that's something, you see, that floods me with happiness, even though it's under very unhappy circumstances, often the times, because people come with their suffering. So I think most of all, I would want every young man to know there's something not to listen to all that macho crap out there. There's something in him that knows what's right for him. And he should spend his life trying to track that, trying to identify it and risk staying in contact with it and try to make choices out of that. If he does, it'll improve the quality of his relationships. It will improve the meaning of his journey. And that's something that men don't always discover in the course of their lifetime. They're still out there pursuing some sort of will of the wisp. And that's very sad indeed.
Right. I mean, I'm very pro people being able to kind of engage in self-healing and improving themselves. But I think an important maybe counterbalance to that you've raised by mentioning the idea of talking to a therapist is, I think that can often play into the slightly pathological psychology of separation, stoicism and isolation of, I'm going to do all the work myself. I'm going to be alone when I do it. I'm going to do it all in private. And for me, I think, dialoguing in therapy, going to plant medicine retreats where there are other people, it unlocks something that you can't unlock by yourself, those interpersonal challenges. So is that something you think is an important component in this work?
Oh, absolutely. And thank you for mentioning that. In fact, I first had my first hour of therapy in my early 30s because I was one of those males that was very self-contained and thought will was everything. You just, if you will it enough and work hard enough, you'll get where you need to get. And then my psyche visited a serious depression on me. And I had to ask the question I would never have asked otherwise. Why has my own psyche revolted? Why has it autonomously withdrawn its approval and support from the places where I want to invest all my energies and my value system? And it took me to my first hour of therapy, in my 30s, little knowing that I would actually wind up changing my career, moving to a different place in the world, and undertaking a whole different kind of journey. At the time, it was miserable, but it was also transformative. So I learned then will is not enough. That's why at times we have to submit that will to something else that is wishing expression. When is the good the enemy of the better, so to speak? So that's why I say that something inside of us knows what is right for us. And that something may not make us comfortable, may make our life difficult. Most of the people that you would admire in history were people who had lives of great conflict, often great suffering. But you admire them because something in them remained faithful to whatever their calling was. And because of that, they lived it through into, whatever their contribution to this world turned out to be. So it wasn't about being comfortable or fitting in or being normal. It was about being true to something that really matters. And that's what each man and each woman needs to figure out too. What really matters to me? And if so, then let me throw myself into that. And if need be, sacrifice the comforts of my ego and my defenses, because that's where my calling will be found.
That's some wonderful wisdom to end on. Thank you so much for your time. I've really enjoyed this. Is there any way you would send people to look into your work more?
Well, they can find it on Amazon or wherever else they want to look, bookstores. So it's been a privilege talking with you, James, and I thank you for your excellent conversation in return. I do appreciate that.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, it's been really fun.